Did you know that North Korea was once seen as a leading industrial power in Asia? Yes, believe it or not, this nation was at the top of its game, even surpassing South Korea in many areas, especially in industry. But now, when we think about North Korea, it's often viewed as one of the poorest and most isolated countries in the world. So what happened? How did North Korea go from being a rising star in Asia to one of the most impoverished nations within just a few decades? Back in the day, North Korea's economy was booming. It had an edge over South Korea, especially in heavy industries like steel and machinery. Some even believed it was the most advanced industrial nation in the region. Fast forward to today, and North Korea's economic situation has drastically changed. The country's gross national income has plummeted to just $35 billion, a tiny fraction of what it used to be. And when you compare it to South Korea, the gap is jaw-dropping. North Korea's trade volume? It's only about 1/400th of what South Korea trades. In terms of industrial production, North Korea makes about 15 cars per year. Yes, just 15. While South Korea is a global powerhouse in the auto industry. So how did things go so wrong? How did a once thriving country end up in such dire straits? In this video, we're going to dive into the key factors behind North Korea's decline and explore the historical events that led to the nation's current struggles. We'll take a close look at how, despite its initial prosperity, North Korea now faces immense challenges, with millions of its people suffering from famine, extreme poverty, and hardship. But don't worry, we'll break it all down for you in a way that's easy to follow, like chatting with a friend. By the end of this video, you'll have a clear picture of how a nation that once had so much potential fell so far behind. And hey, if you find this topic as fascinating as we do, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey of discovery. Let's get started. Let's take a journey back to North Korea's golden age. You might be wondering, how did it all go wrong? Well, there are 3 key reasons why North Korea fell into poverty. First, the collapse of the socialist bloc, which they relied on heavily for economic support. Second, political decisions that seemed unrealistic and ended up being disastrous. And finally, an unbalanced budget that focused far too much on military spending instead of the needs of the people. We'll get into these reasons in more detail soon. But first, let's rewind to when North Korea was at its peak. From the late 1950s to the 1970s, North Korea's economy was booming. In the 1960s, believe it or not, North Korea's GDP per capita was higher than South Korea's. It was celebrated as a successful socialist state, and its economic growth outpaced many countries in Asia. A big reason for this success was North Korea's wealth of natural resources. Though its mountainous landscape wasn't ideal for farming, the country was sitting on vast deposits of iron, gold, and other minerals. In fact, it ranked among the top 10 globally in terms of mineral wealth. Meanwhile, South Korea, which didn't have nearly as many mineral resources, was lucky to have fertile land perfect for rice farming. At that time, North Korea seemed unstoppable, and its industrial growth was impressive. But as we'll see, relying too much on external aid and focusing too much on military strength would eventually lead to its downfall. Stick around as we dive deeper into how North Korea's prosperity slowly turned into hardship. During this time, North Korea saw an incredible economic growth rate of 15%, which even outpaced Japan's rapid economic growth, where the rate hovered around 10%. This rapid development wasn't just by chance. It was fueled by significant financial aid from the Soviet Union and China. Over a span of 10 years, North Korea received around $1.65 billion in aid, which would be about 25 billion yen today. This funding wasn't just out of goodwill. Both the Soviet Union and China saw North Korea's success as crucial for bolstering the image of socialism on the world stage. To solidify North Korea's industrial power, Kim Il-sung, the country's leader, directed a massive 80% of this aid toward heavy industries, particularly iron, steel, and machinery, to build up the nation's strength. However, this economic miracle was built on a fragile foundation. North Korea's prosperity was heavily dependent on foreign aid, making the country vulnerable to changes in international politics. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, North Korea's economy took a sharp nosedive. The country had been relying on the Soviet Union for essential supplies, especially oil, to keep its factories running. At its peak, North Korea imported around 3.5 million tons of oil annually from the Soviets to power its industries and provide electricity. But after the Soviet Union fell apart, these shipments dropped drastically to just 45,000 tons, a severe and sudden shortage that crippled the country's industrial sector. In just a few short years, North Korea's economy shrank by 50%. What had once been a growing, thriving economy was now spiraling into severe hardship. Without the steady flow of oil and other essential resources, factories closed, power outages became widespread, and the nation was plunged into an economic crisis that it still struggles to recover from today. This shift marked the beginning of North Korea's steep decline, a far cry from its once promising future. At the same time, South Korea, which had once been trailing behind North Korea economically, started to pull ahead. By the late 1980s, South Korea's economy was booming, and by the time it hosted the 1988 Seoul Olympics, the wealth gap between the two countries had become glaring. In response, North Korea organized the World Festival of Youth and Students in Pyongyang as a counter-event to show off its global presence. Around this time, in 1987, North Korea was also responsible for the bombing of a South Korean airliner, a clear attempt to diminish South Korea's growing international reputation. These acts showed North Korea's increasing desperation as it struggled to keep up with its southern counterpart. Along with the collapse of the Soviet Union, North Korea's internal policies were a major factor in its downfall. Kim Il-sung's *Juche* philosophy, which focused on self-reliance, became the driving force behind North Korea's economic approach in the 1960s. While the idea of independence seemed appealing, it often led to disastrous consequences, particularly in agriculture. One notorious example was the decision to plant corn on steep hillsides, which caused massive soil erosion and landslides, severely damaging the environment. Another failed approach was dense planting, where crops were placed too close together, draining the soil of nutrients and turning fertile land into deserts. These misguided agricultural strategies were a major factor in the widespread famine that hit North Korea in the 1990s, leading to the tragic deaths of around 3 million people. On top of these internal struggles, North Korea's military-first policy, known as Songun, only worsened its economic troubles. When Kim Jong-il took over from his father Kim Il-sung in 1994, the country's already limited resources were funneled heavily toward the military. At its peak, about 20% of North Korea's budget was dedicated to defense, compared to around 2% in China and just 1% in Japan. This huge imbalance proved disastrous for North Korea's economy. While the military grew in strength, the civilian population faced severe consequences. Agricultural production dropped sharply, and widespread food shortages became the norm, leading to the devastating famine of the 1990s, during which roughly 10% of the population, or about 3 million people, died from starvation. Adding to these challenges, North Korea's relentless pursuit of nuclear weapons further isolated the country from the global community. Starting in the early 2000s, North Korea carried out a series of nuclear tests and missile launches, which drew harsh criticism from the United Nations, the United States, and other world powers. The sanctions that followed crippled the nation's already fragile economy, making it even harder for the regime to provide for its people. Despite this, North Korea continued to pour enormous amounts of money into its military and missile programs. For instance, one test of the Taepodong missile reportedly cost around $500 million, with 7 tests being conducted in a single day. The financial strain of maintaining such an aggressive military agenda drained the country's resources, pushing North Korea even deeper into poverty. Today, North Korea stands as one of the most isolated and impoverished countries in the world. Under the leadership of Kim Jong-un, the government continues to prioritize military power, especially nuclear weapons, over the well-being of its citizens. This focus on militarization has led to even more international sanctions, further crippling an already struggling economy. The people of North Korea endure daily hardships, from frequent blackouts to a severe lack of clean water and basic healthcare services. A nation that once boasted economic success in the 1960s and 1970s now struggles to meet the most basic needs of its population. As we look back on North Korea's history, it's clear that the future of the country hinges on external factors, whether it's the potential for foreign aid or a shift in leadership. It's uncertain whether North Korea can ever return to its former economic strength. Without major reforms, however, the suffering of the North Korean people is likely to persist. We hope this video has helped you better understand the complex factors that have led North Korea to its current state. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more insightful content. Thank you for watching.